challenge as we go about trying to achieve those targets?
Shireen, let me begin by saying that, we use these animal analogies like, the Chinese dragon or the Indian elephant or tiger. And it always worries me a little bit because, when you have the dragon, it's a myth. And if it's a tiger, it's going extinct. So it's always...
So we can switch to the cows.
Perhaps yes. So now, as far as the idea of governance and New India is concerned, I think the question obviously arises, what do you mean by this New India? What does Prime Minister Modi specifically mean by the New India? I think if you listen to his speeches, one of the things that he's trying to do, whether he succeeds or not is a different issue, but he's very clear about what he's trying to achieve. Basically, he wants to move India from basically a patronage-based, rent-seeking society or economy to one that is much more based on entrepreneurship, on the idea of churn, and as a rule-based, high-trust society. So if you look at the kinds of reforms that have been done over the last couple of years, there is a pattern in the kind of things he's doing. So, for example, let's take one of the reforms that came up fairly early on and has been, in fact, a great success, although not talked about so much, which is bankruptcy and insolvency. Why do you want why, of all the housing reforms you want to do, why would you want to do bankruptcy or insolvency as one of the major reforms? The reason for that is, if you want an entrepreneurial society, and you likes to use the word manthan very often, which means churn. If you want a society which is based on churn, then you need exit as much as you need entry. So of all the things that, therefore, this government was very concerned about was, if you want this kind of a society, you need an exit. So, bankruptcy and insolvency. Now, then it fits together how, for example, we've just done the bank recapitalization. Why did we go about it in that particular way than any other way? If you remember...
what way is it? Because we're still awaiting details on what way you intend to take the recapitalization forward.
Let me explain the theory then, at least, so that maybe it makes some sense. See, if you went back a year ago, you see, this fact that the banks had an NPA problem is not a new problem.
No,
it's been known for some time. Raghu had also thought about it, and so on. And so, when the beginning of this year, the thinking was, let's create a bad bank, take all this bad stuff and stick it into that bad bank. At least the banks will be freed up of all of this. As a natural process, it will also get recapitalized because you put the stuff in the bad bank. Some money will go into the banks, and the banks could get back to the business of lending. However, we opted to take a very different approach to this, which is that instead of creating the bad bank, we decided that, look, we need to create a culture change. See, if you just give the money back to the banks, they'll go back to doing what they were doing before. And meanwhile, all this bad assets would end up in this warehouse called the bad bank and would fester there forever, like with the BIFR. So instead, we leave the bad stuff with the banks and force them to recognize that there is a problem and additionally to provide for them and meet all the various regulatory requirements. Now, when you do that, it's very painful, by the way, for the banks. But we took the pain and then used a brand new NCLT bankruptcy process to force through some of these things to getting resolved, liquidated if necessary. And having now established a new culture where simply evergreening bad stuff from the past is not an option. Once we were satisfied that this was, well, at least some degree set in, then, just last few days ago, we decided to recapitalize them with this 2.1 lakh crore infusion. But even there, notice how we went about it. What we have basically done is recognize what was the central problem. The central problem is not that the banks don't have cash. They've in fact got excessive amounts of cash. In fact, the central bank is having to mop it up. So why isn't it that they're lending? The reason they're not lending is that the capital requirements of the banks are not being met. So if you don't meet the capital requirements, you can have all the cash in the world, we can't lend. So what we are doing in this capitalization is creating something called recapitalization bonds.
Yeah.
So basically what you do is that the government uses this recap bonds, takes part of the excess cash out and sticks it back in the banks to recapitalize them. Now this capital that you create allows the banks to leverage for the rest of the money that they have and lend out. So, as a matter of, so we could have done this right at the beginning, but we didn't because of the new India, idea of a new India that I just said, a rule-based society where you've done a culture change and shifted away from the rent-seeking behavior to an entrepreneurial behavior.
I would have liked to continue on the recapitalization idea and the plan that you put forward, but this is not the audience to be able to do that. But let me, Sonu, I'll come to you in just a second, but let me take the larger point that Sanjeev makes here, ShashiTharoor, and put that forward to you, that the idea of New India is to move away from an idea of patronage, of rent-seeking, of moving towards a much more formalized economy, of moving towards performance as opposed to a situation where the government and the bureaucracy gets to decide who gets what. You can't argue with that, can you?
But we're not. I mean, you know, the objectives that Sanjeev, my good friend, has spelled out are certainly unexceptionable. It's how we get there. As far as banking and insolvency is concerned, that was a UPA draft. So let's not act as if this is somehow a new thinking. It's something we were trying to do. As you know, we faced 7 years at least of complete obstructionism from the people who are now in power on banking and insolvency, on the direct tax bill, and on GST, as well as on FDI in retail. So if we had got all of these things through, if Mr. Modi and Sushma Swaraj and others had not opposed them, would we have been talking about a new India?
Maybe you needed better powers of persuasion. Maybe you needed better powers of persuasion.
Can I just one response?
Yeah, okay.
Yes, the draft we got for you, but all the bad loans also we got from you.
I don't want to...
No, I mean, there's simply no
comparison. I want this to be
No, since Sanjeev has said that, Shireen, I don't like to meme either. But Congress left with 2,389 MPAs. It's up to 8,600 crores MPAs. So, unfortunately, it's actually...
That's not true. We just recognize them.
Okay,
that's all. But anyway. Time
out on this one.
Even your solution...
We're talking about 2022. We're not talking about 2018.
We're not.
Let's talk about 2022.
Let me just mention on the bonds thing that ultimately the government still has to pay back those bonds. So, I mean...
Yes, of course. That's the whole point about a bond, no?
Let me get out of the politics for a minute.
That is exactly what I'm attempting to do. And let me put that issue to you, Gurcharan Das. Let's talk about the state's capacity to be able to execute this New India vision by 2022. And what you believe...
That vision is great. It's how it's implemented that matters. We believe GST was a great idea that's been colossally botched up, for example. And you can't shift from driving on the left of the road to the right of the road gradually. You have to have a comprehensive vision and go for it. What we're seeing right now is shambolic, and that's our problem.
Okay, Gurcharan Das, shambolic or not, let's talk about the New India vision by 2022 and whether you believe governance is going to be the biggest obstruction in being able to achieve that.
Yeah, so let's take this discussion away from being a TV panel to my type of discussion.
You have to give me full points. The anchor here is trying to calm people down.
Of course you are. And the reality is that India is a bottom-up success, unlike China, which is a top-down success. And so India's rise is almost, whereas China's rise is because of the state which built this amazing infrastructure. India's rise is almost despite the state. And that's why I wrote this book called India Grows at Night. But I didn't want to be too insulting. And whereas the full sentence should be, India grows at night when the government sleeps. So, really the issue is absolutely right. The issue, we keep talking every night on television about accountability. But the real issue is state capacity. Even this GST, which is a fine idea, has got botched up because of very poor state capacity.
Okay.
The reason why people were excited about Modi was because we thought that here was a guy who could really do what Margaret Thatcher did, which was actually to reform the state. And why was this state was created? Because of governance. So the most important reform we need really is the reform of the administration, the police, and the judiciary. Why should it take 15 years to get justice in the courts? Why should a civil servant who works 1 hour a day and a civil servant who works 12 hours a day get paid exactly the same and get promoted on exactly the same day? These are the things that offend the Indian people, and this is what we hoped that Mr. Modi. So when I put it, when I put this to Mr. Modi a few years ago, and I said, look, this is the job. This is why you talked about minimum government and maximum governance.
Yes.
And I said, we bought that message. So when are you going to do it? He said, when you're going to be around for 10 years, you don't do these kind of things in your first year. You wait, and even Margaret Thatcher, he quoted, did it in her second term. So if there's an agenda now for our country, the most important economic reform really is the reform of the state. And just like as China will not become a developed country until it fixes its politics, India will not become a developed. We'll both become good middle-income countries, but we won't become developed until we fix governance.
Until we fix governance, we're not going to be able to achieve the goal of becoming a developed economy by 2022, which is our aspiration, Sonu. But on the larger issue that Gurcharan raised here, and that was the promise with which this government came to office, and I'm not just talking about this government, but we're talking about India's future in the context of what we aspire to do. The role of the state. What do we mean when we say minimum government and maximum governance? What does that really mean? And especially in areas like healthcare and education, can we really have unfettered free markets?
So before I answer that question specifically, let me just tell you, when we talk of New India, for me it is also important to understand what was the old India. And for me, the three standout points for old India was that it's large and complex. There's a very wide difference of socio-economic factors. And third, that there was no equal opportunity for ambition. And when we are talking of New India, it will still remain large and complex. For my New India, the distance between socio-economic factors will collapse. But most importantly, there will be equal opportunity for ambition. And when I say that, when I talk of why opportunity or ambition was stifled in old India, was because we had a large number of rules. Hard governance, very, very large number and complex rules, but these rules were different for different people. And therefore, if you were able to interpret the rules in your favor, you did well. And third, the nature of the economy was a brick and mortar. The new governance or the new economy, for me, the buzzword is digital. Digital is going to ensure that governance can take place with minimum government, right? The rules may not change, the rules may remain complex, but there will be transparency. There will be transparency, and the economy, when it moves away from brick and mortar to digital, it does give equal opportunity to people, and therefore, services like healthcare, education. Why do we need to depend on brick and mortar delivery? Digital is going to allow these services to reach out to the larger people, And therefore, the governance that is required is really building the framework and monitoring through digital people who kind of just move away from that framework. So for me, I don't need to create large distribution. I don't need to create large manufacturing in order to do well in New India.
Well, are you sure about that? I mean, do we not need to focus on manufacturing?
No, I'll tell you.
Especially when
why.
we have a jobs problem to deal with.
Yeah. So, see, earlier, if I were a small manufacturer who's making handmade chocolates at home, I could never go national because I would need to appoint distributors who would need to take my product to the length and breadth of the country. And for me, I would have to have a large-scale operation.
Yeah.
Today, I don't need that. Today, I make chocolates at home.
Yeah.
I sign up with Amazon. I sign up with Flipkart. I can actually make good quality chocolates at home and grow the business as much as I want to.
Right.
And still be able to deliver in Delhi as well as in Agartala or in Basi or in Paidikado.
Okay, so the point that you're making there is on entrepreneurship and aspiration. But Sanjeev Sanyal, let me come to you now because we're talking about the future. Manufacturing, the way that the Make in India program was launched and the target that we've set for ourselves of 25% of GDP by 2022, which at this point in time looks like a far cry from where we are. How do we address the manufacturing challenge and how do we link that to the job challenge? Because if India is going to aspire to create high-skilled jobs, we do have a problem at being able to create the number of jobs that we need to create to be able to capture the demographic dividend and the demographic advantage that we keep talking about. So what is the manufacturing strategy really going to be as India looks to the future?
So let me just respond to something that Gurcharan just said earlier. He mentioned that the Indian economy grows when the government is asleep. And then he said there should be an income disparity between the civil servant who works 1 hour and the one who works 12 hours. So I'm assuming the one who works 1 hour should be paid more. So anyway, to come to your question about manufacturing. Now this is actually a very serious issue.
Yeah.
Because you see, we have actually seen now some 20 odd years of reasonably good growth through, governments by various governments. But the growth has been very heavily skewed towards services.
Services, yes.
Now services has proved to have one major problem, and which is the following. You see, our economy is such that only 13% of the economy is agriculture, but it uses up some more than 45% of the jobs it produces. Services, on the other hand, does more than 2/3 of the economy, but produces only 1/4 of the jobs. So what has happened is that the manufacturing and construction sector is the sector which can both has the potential of generating growth and it takes its load on jobs. Services generates growth but not jobs. So this is the reason why all governments, including the previous government, thought about manufacturing and construction as being a serious sector. Now there is a serious problem with this now, in that we cannot just think about doing this the way, say, the East Asian countries did it, because we are simultaneously going through enormous technological shifts, which mean that whether it's robotics or it is automation and all of this kind of thing will mean that we will have to do this in a very different environment than would have if we had attempted this over the last 40 years.
So when you talk about needing to do it in a very different environment, what is the policy imperative that this sets up for us? Because if we cannot do what China did, because A, we don't have the capacity to be able to do what China did.
So therefore, so there is...
So what is it that we need to do differently and what will drive the policy imperative?
Absolutely. So the thing is here is that we have to begin to think about our internal market much, much more seriously. So that is one. Secondly, one major source of growth, whether it's even in East Asia, was not manufacturing, but a secondary sector is actually construction. And it's not as if, you see, people think you create infrastructure and you therefore enable growth. In fact, the creation of the infrastructure is a large part of the growth itself. So a very big area has got to be urbanization.
Sure.
We've got to think about creating much more infrastructure. We are one of the few countries in the world which can actually genuinely build brand new infrastructure in scales.
Sure.
It happens to be that we may be here where the advantage of this point in history is capital is likely to be cheap for a whole generation because China will keep pumping out capital for a long time to come.
Yeah.
So while the disadvantage is that we will be doing in this peculiar period with automation and so on the other hand, we are likely to do it for a prolonged period of cheap capital.
Yeah.
So we have to utilize the availability of cheap capital on one hand, but at the same time, when we're manufacturing and getting into this new area, try to do it in a way that we do not lock ourselves into technologies that are already rapidly becoming outdated.
Okay, I want to pick up on a couple of the points that you made, and I'll come to both Mr. Das as well as ShashiTharoor, but for all of you who are here, the embargo is now lifted, so I can inform you that we're up 30 places on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report. India, for the first time, has now come into the top 100. So that's good news there. As far as India and the Indian economy is concerned, we've jumped 30 places on the Ease of Doing Business report, which has just been released by the World Bank. But I want to pick up on the point that Sanjeev Sanyal made there, saying that, look, we need to focus on the domestic market. And I think for too long, we've taken that attitude because our share of global trade is under 2% currently, Gurcharan does. And if we continue to take that attitude, are we going to be able to achieve 25% of manufacturing by 2022, create the jobs that we want to create, and achieve an 8% plus growth for the next 30 years?
I often agree with Sanjeev, but here I disagree. No country achieved the kind of growth, 8 to 10% growth, which we need to do by depending on the domestic market. We forget, actually Arvind Panagriya used to remind us every day that today the world's trade in goods is $17 trillion. And as Shireen just said, India has 1.7%. Even if we can go up by 0.5% market share, we will solve the job challenge. The biggest failure so far of this government, in my view, is, and I don't want to blame the minister just got promoted, but the reality is that India has not seized this moment. India, this is the moment that Arvind Subramaniam keeps talking about this also, but not doing anything about it. This is the moment that India should be leading globalization when everybody else is closing down. This is the moment when we should be absolutely unilaterally opening ourselves up and have the strength, have an agricultural policy that's consistent and for our farmers.
This in the context of now the Chinese saying that we're going to be a much more open economy. But ShashiTharoor, we need to look into our past to be able to address this issue, and I know that this is an issue that you've spent a lot of your time talking about, and Sanjeev, I'll get you to comment on that. What are the lessons that we can perhaps learn from our history of being an exporter to the world to be able to reclaim world share?
There's a great deal to be said. In fact, I've said it in my last book as well. But before getting there, let me briefly comment on what Sanjeev and Gurcharan, both of whom I've agreed with a lot over the years, have just said. I happen to agree with Gurcharan very much. We need to improve our trade, and I agree with Sanjeev that infrastructure is rather important. But there's one important omission. I'm a bit taken aback by the fact that both my own government and the present one seems oblivious to the fact there's a whole series of studies that says that $1,000 invested in tourism will employ 8 times as many people as $1,000 invested in manufacturing. We keep going on and on about manufacturing at a time when we may well have missed the bus that China caught, at a time when robotization and artificial intelligence means we're saying make in India for things that may not be made by human beings anywhere anymore. But we are not investing enough money in building the tourist infrastructure that'll get more people flocking in. Tourism employs semi-skilled and unskilled labor in ways that other things don't. tourism. Dubai and Singapore get more people visiting them in a day from abroad than we get in terms of foreign tourists in a year.
Yeah.
Now, very clearly, this has been a missed opportunity for a very long time.
Yes.
And it seems to me it's an almost no-brainer that if the government were to spend money and time on tourist infrastructure and go on an aggressive campaign to attract tourists, but give them facilities that won't turn them off. Right now, word of mouth about our tourist spots is actually causing negative publicity, not positive. If we could do that, we could actually partly solve our jobs crisis as well.
Okay.
Now, on the history thing, just to answer your question since you asked it, the fact is that we were the world's leading exporters, for example, of cottons and muslins, linen and so on, 2,000 years. The Roman Empire, there are debates recorded by Pliny the Elder of Roman senators complaining that all of Rome's gold was ending up in India because of the taste of Roman women for Indian cloth
and Roman senators for Indian togas.
Exactly. It was very much a hallmark of aristocracy. I found accounts in English shopkeepers, by the way, trying to pass off shoddily made local goods as made in India, because made in India was the cachet of quality right up to the 18th century. So we need to recapture that, but the world has changed, the world has moved on, and though the lesson may be that we thrived in an era of free trade, and particularly in exporting things that our people made better and cheaper than anybody else, we have to look at today's reality where that better and cheaper option may not be available for a whole range of goods anymore, as it was available before the British wrecked our export market.
Well, Sonu, let me come to you because ShashiTharoor here brought up one of the low-hanging fruits which ought to have been addressed by his government and hopefully will be addressed by this government. Tourism, of course, is one of those things that we've often spoken about, and many reports have been done on what it could do in terms of foreign exchange earnings and job creation and so on and so forth. In terms of low-hanging fruit and missed opportunity, what do you believe, is ripe for the picking, so to speak, at this point in time, in terms of the unfinished reform agenda that you would like to see?
So Shireen, again, if I knew what were those low-hanging fruits, I guess I would make a lot of money because I would go and buy those stocks. But let me give you an example when we're talking of manufacturing and exports. When we were in the 90s and India was supposed to be a superpower by 2000 and 2010, we were just young managers. We had no clue how India could become a superpower. Then Y2K happened. And suddenly, India's position in the world changed. India became an exporter of IT services, right? And we rode that wave for 10 years. Today, again, we're asking ourselves the question, where are we going to create the jobs? What are we going to export? What is going to be that one factor, service, manufacturing, whatever, that is going to do another Y2K? Frankly, I don't have the answer. There are a lot of low-hanging fruits that are there, but India will need to identify, and Y2K I think happened by, I don't know whether we planned for it, but the way that India is going, and we are looking at digital delivery of products and services, to my mind, that will have to do something around the digital economy.
The lowest hanging fruit, in my view, actually, is something that will, if Mr. Modi can realize his vision of housing for all by 2022, even if he realizes half of that vision, in every country, but especially in India, the largest creator of jobs is housing, houses. And the deficit of India is one of the largest. And there are, in this case, I'm often critical of this government, but in this case, they have created 8 PPP models for housing. And if we just pursue that single-mindedly, that will be, that along with tourism, will be a very major low-hanging fruit.
Well, you spoke about housing for all. Unfortunately, this is one indicator on the World Bank's ease of doing business where we actually haven't done as well as we were hoping. Construction permits have only gone up very marginally, but there is scope for improvement. But I want to take this conversation forward, Sanjeev, and talk to you about, and you know, we obsess about GDP growing at 8%, 8.5% or 5.7% or whatever the case may be. But the fact of the matter is we don't spend enough time talking about the quality of growth. And I think it is imperative that we now have a plan on how we intend to attack the problems of literacy, how we intend to attack the challenge of including more women in the workforce, where we've seen a decline both in urban areas as well as rural areas. What do we do about things like malnourishment, stunting? I think the quality of growth and the policy imperatives, the policy prescription that you would like to take forward to be able to ensure that we do better on the Human Development Index.
So they're all linked, by the way, to this question. But let me just quickly respond. I agree totally with Shashi. I mean, tourism is an area where a lot of quick returns are available. It's much better done at the state level, but nevertheless, I think even if the central government takes the effort, identifies a few sort of destinations and helps develop them, that would be fantastic. One of the very simple things that needs to be done is actually Swachh Bharat. One of the biggest problems with Indian destinations is simply that they are dirty. I mean, our ancestors have left us some wonderful, lovely places, but they're just a mess. Taj may be beautiful, but Agra, the city, is hardly a great experience for people. So I think I totally agree that tourism is an area. Also agree on housing as being an area that we need to focus on. We are actually working on a new national urban policy. A committee has been formed, of which I am a member, and we will be writing a new national urban policy over the next few months, and hopefully early next year you'll have it, in which some of these issues will be very, very prominently play a role. So we'll see how that plays out. Now, the question you asked is GDP a sensible measure of human progress? It's a good question, by the way, not a new.
I'm not saying it's
a new question, but
we need to look beyond that.
You're absolutely right.
On the quality of growth.
You're absolutely right. Incidentally, I have maybe about a decade ago written extensively on the whole issue of recalculating GDP, green GDP, taking both environmental and social issues into account. And by the way, when you do that, the numbers can be very, very different, by the way.
Yeah.
We are attempting to revive some of that work and trying to create a new green GDP series.
Driven by the state, the actual execution on the ground driven by the state, or do you actually see a larger role for private capital, for private investors?
So that's a different issue. So one is a measurement issue.
Yeah.
You see, there is a GDP measures progress in a certain way.
Forget the measurement issue for a second, because if you look at any parameter, if you look at the WHO parameters, look at the Human Development Index, I mean, we're disappointing on each of those indicators, whether it's per capita income, it's literacy, and so on and so forth.
After 4 years, we're at number 100.
That's unfair. That's unfair, Shashi.
These are good.
You set us a very stiff target. That's the problem.
We're up 30 places. It's the best we've ever
We're
done.
100th in the world.
It's the best.
We're 100th out of 100.
Yeah, but we were 142. We were 130. Today we're 100. So
let me say one thing, Shashi. That the World Bank head who came to India, who's in charge of the Ease of Doing Business report, said something devastating about your government. He said that until this government came, not a single government in India paid any attention to the ease of doing business.
Yeah.
And he said these people, he said, we have not gone, we're making some progress, but he said at least they took it seriously. They took the idea that India can be created as a business society. And
right. I mean, the fact is that those here who've read my Penguin books, India from Midnight to Millennium and The Elephant, the Tiger and the Cell Phone, know that I was just as scathing about the governments of the past and where they've led us to in this area. So I don't disagree with that. The fact is, when the Prime Minister of India announces a target and fails spectacularly to underperform 4 years later, it's worth pointing out, surely, before we start celebrating too much.
All right.
So let me say I'm glad that Shashi holds our government to a higher standard than his own.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the close. I want to focus on something which is also equally important as we talk about measuring growth and human development indicators, and that's culture. And I go back again to the Prime Minister's speech where he talked about the new India being about Shanti, Ekta and Sadbhavna. And I pointed out at the start of our panel in my introduction that a lot of the government's reforms, whether it's demonetization, etc., the Prime Minister has sold it with the idea of morality and sacrifice. So when we talk about culture, and you've written a lot about dharma, Gurcharan, so let me start by asking you, what should be India's dharma as we go forward?
Actually, the idea of Swachh Bharat, which has been mentioned by both panelists here, to me, if we can make some difference there, it will not only help tourism, but it will help mental hygiene also of the country. So, the dharma, I mean, there are many things that we could say about dharma, but frankly, to me, the most inspiring thing the stories that I hear from small towns, whenever I travel, I ask this question. It's the young people today in schools who are telling their parents not to throw things out of the window. And to me, that's a dharma that we should applaud.
Sonu, let me come to you. The dharma for New India.
So the dharma for New India is driven by the youth because they don't have a past baggage. And our dharma over the last 40-50 years has been colored by maybe the kind of times that we lived in and scarcity and all of that. I think the youth here today are extremely fortunate to be in the India of today because they have no baggage to carry, and therefore, they are extremely proud of their country. And for me, the dharma is being proud of the country, being proud of yourself, being proud of the family that you belong to, which does not mean that you are unproud or whatever is the opposite, or you look down upon anybody else. I think whenever we look at India's glorious past, we've always looked at times where everybody was happy. The dharma was that of assimilation rather than exclusion. And going forward, I think the youth of today have no history with Pakistan, have no history with anything. They are not concerned. All they want are jobs, they want a better life, they want to get on with their lives. They want their cities, their homes to be clean.
If you watch primetime television, you wouldn't think that was the case, Sonu. It's all about Pakistan night after night, isn't it?
Get some teenagers there and then you have a talk with them. Get somebody who's 25 years old and have them in the panel. I think you'll have a different panel at that time. So for me, the dharma is being a proud Indian, believing in the India of the future and believing that we'll get there no matter what we are going through today.
Dharma for India.
So I agree with Gurcharan that dharma may be the better way of thinking about New India than the idea of morality. It's a much broader idea, whereas morality is a bit preachy, let's say. So I would much rather go with dharma. And to put it in context, ultimately dharma is about creating a high trust society. And I think that is part of what we are attempting to do, a culture change. Whether we succeed or not, I do not know, but certainly Prime Minister Modi's New India is about shifting India's culture to Swachh Bharat or a high trust society or the idea of churn and manthan. And I think, dharma is a good way to think about it.
Well, we started with the government, we'll end with the opposition. ShashiTharoor, dharma for India.
Two parts, I'd say. The first is that whether we're growing at 8% as we used to, or at 5 and below, as we currently seem to be doing, we mustn't lose sight of the 25% at the bottom of our society. Because the fact is that the magic of the market will not appeal to those who can't afford to enter the marketplace. And while I'm very proud of my party's role in liberalization, I'm a strong advocate of economic growth, it's essential that the fruits of that growth be shared with the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor, the excluded. So that's the first part of our dharma, that we make sure we bring everyone along. It should be truly sabka vikas, and it's not as
You're sounding like the government now.
No, I'm sounding like the once and future government. But the second aspect, which I suspect all 4 of us would agree on, is that it is important to set ourselves high aspirations. I believe that the India of the last generation of high growth and change, of whichever government, has been an India in which we've been able to set ourselves tasks and hopes that we didn't dare to feel and express in the past, that we've liberated the creative energies of our people, that we're now unafraid of the products or the prowess of the outside world, and that we're determined to actually get there, to become. I don't think we can be a superpower because honestly we're still super poor. But, well,
remember Y2K.
That's the next Y2, whatever, is a few decades away. But what I wanted to say was that as long as we have those aspirations to aim at, we can measure ourselves, Sanjeev's point about the standards by which we must measure ourselves against goals that we've fulfilled or failed to fulfill. And in that way, I genuinely believe if we can actually strive against those aspirations, we can still make the 21st century our own.
Well, Sanjeev, Sania, ShashiTharoor, Sonu and Gurcharan, appreciate you joining us here on this very special panel to talk about the future of India and whether we can achieve the aspiration of a new vision for India by 2022. Transparency, trust, confidence, belief, and I think the ability to dream big. I think that is what should propel this vision for new India forward, and a vision that we all take forward together. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for brilliantly moderating the panel. We'll open the panel now for questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll pass the mic around. The front.
Honestly, I just didn't understand half of what you all said. Thank you for making me realize I've learned a lot. I just came here to talk to you, sir. I just have one question, honestly. Why do you write? Just why
to
do
be
you
read. No, I believe I have something to say, and I, enjoy saying it and finding an audience of people who seem to want to read it. And clearly, your question implies you're not one of those who likes to read what I've written. But okay, no, I mean, the thing is, honestly, one writes because one has something to say, and through writing, you reach a much larger audience. I mean, I don't know Sonu well enough, but the others have all written. And we all have about the same motive. We want to get some ideas across. There we are. Good for you. So all of us are writing because we have ideas we want to express and share to the world. And in my case, I've tried various forms. In my 16 books, I've written fiction, because fiction, like that famous beer commercial, reaches parts that other kinds of writing don't reach. And I've also tried non-fiction. I've tried not to mix the two up, as some people in our government prefer to do.
Let me just add to that in my case, I think it's also a process of self-cultivation, that questions keep coming up in your mind from week to week, from month to month, year to year. And writing is a way to clear the mind, actually. To read others, to clear your own mind, to build some convictions. And that's why I write.
I used to say it much less politely. I'd say it's a way of scratching at an itch inside you. But I think clearing the mind sounds much more civilized.
The gentleman in white, please. the mic.
I think urbanization as mantra seems to be, commonly accepted, and I think among the panel also that seems to be the thing. We've seen Mumbai, Chennai, and Hyderabad, and Bangalore, including pothole deaths and whatnot. So if the mantra is okay, but where is the model gone, and does India have to do this differently? Or at least shift from the present paradigm of the urbanization, the way that we are thinking and doing and planning. And no planning as such, actually.
Sanjeev is the man.
Well, let me clarify that urbanization is happening, whether you like it or not. You visit any village in any part of the country, and I travel quite extensively, I have almost rarely found any farmer's child who wants to continue farming. So this process is going to happen. It's nothing unique to us. It's happened in every country at a certain point in development. They urbanize. Now the question is therefore not about whether or not it will urbanize. The question is how we will go about it. And as it has happened, the urbanization that we have done has been a very peculiar kind. In fact, since independence, we have failed to create a single successful case of urbanization. Our major cities today are still essentially the cities the British left us, the urban core. They've expanded around them, whether it's Bangalore, Mumbai, Delhi or whatever. Chandigarh, I'm sorry, has not been a great example of urbanization. In fact, I often talk about it as a great example of a subsidy scheme for civil servants. It's not a city at all. It uses an enormous amount of land to house a tiny group of people. And frankly, it is a model that cannot be scaled up. To the extent Chandigarh works at all, it happens because of Mohali, which is not a part of the plan. So, sadly, we have not created great models of growth. And I think part of the reason is that after independence, we began to think about cities as some sort of a machine for living, which is what Le Corbusier used to call cities, by the way. And the ghost of Le Corbusier, who, by the way, is not thought of being a great city planner anywhere outside of India. I mean, in France, he's thought to be a total disaster. And in many other places, in Switzerland and so on. So I think we need a new way of thinking about cities. And that way of thinking about cities will require us to go back a little bit, maybe even past the British, to an earlier era of urban thinking. And think about cities in a much more Indian way. So Indian cities tend to be much more organic, they tend to be much denser, they fit much better to the way we live. When you talk about ideal cities today, they'll always come out with words like density, mixed use, common spaces for public spaces that are commonly used, and so on. If you use all these commonly used words, you'll see it in urbanization, urban literature. And then you say, which city in India accords with this the best? And oddly enough, the city that accords with this the best is Varanasi. Think of a city that is organically evolving, is completely mixed use of all kinds. The ghats of Varanasi, by the way, are the most open public space you could possibly see anywhere in India. And the point of the matter is, and it of course fits with our culture, our way of living and so on. So I would say, ironically, it's not about creating another Chandigarh, but about figuring out what makes Varanasi work. In fact, one of the interesting things here, whenever we talk to people, they say, Indians used to have great cities in the past, and they'll talk about Harappa. The latest research suggests, by the way, that Varanasi is just as old, and it has survived all this while, 6,000 years. There must be something about Varanasi that works. So, when you go to Varanasi, learn about one thing. It's a problem we tried driving around those cities. We have tried to walk around Varanasi, it works perfectly well. So it's about managing Varanasi better, not about creating another Chandigarh. So,
our model can't be a place where people go to die.
Yes, they go to die because that's also the place where you live. In our philosophy, by the way, life and death are interconnected.
We believe in reincarnation. But jokes apart, you've got 7 greenfield cities on the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. There's your chance to demonstrate.
Absolutely. So we need to think this through. The way, unfortunately, these cities are being built, whether it was under your government or now, our thinking is being totally dominated by this very mechanical, Corbusierian view of how to build cities. Whereas what we need to do is to go back to building much more organic cities, much more mix and match between where people live, where they work.
Have you looked at Amravati's planning?
And so, yeah, so there is being some debate about Amravati's planning. My personal view is that is not the way to go about it. I would much prefer a much more organic, evolutionary way of thinking about cities, not separating where people live and work,
and yes,
different uses.
And get rid of our bias against height.
Absolutely, density.
In a country which is short of space with lots of people, we should be going upwards instead of going. The Lutyens Delhi is the worst example.
So I would say,
but in a country where electricity breaks down as often as it does, including in Lutyens Delhi,
and so
you can't afford to be stuck on the 38th floor.
Look at you, IIT Delhi. Look at the amount of space. JNU. Look at the space that's wasted.
See, in fact,
these universities should be up in towers.
Not just that. See, they should integrate with the city. So just
they're up in ivory towers already.
No, you should integrate with the city as well. So, the way universities used to be built, and he also went to colleges, were perfectly good colleges, built on 10, 15 acres of land. Why do we need 300, 400 acres of land far away from the city? Human capital agglomeration happens in the middle of the city. New institutes should be built in the middle of the city. Go everywhere in the world, the cities have great universities inside them, not 500 acres far away from the city. So what I'm trying to say is, the idea is to integrate and mix and match all these things, build a much more organic city.
Thank you, Sanjeev. We'll take the next question now from the gentleman on the right.
Mr. Das. Today we had a World Trade report about ease of doing business. It's improved from 130 to 100. So is it because of demonetization and GST or what is the reason?
No, it's not because of demonetization or GST. Actually, this report is less important than the report that came out a few months ago, which was written by IDFC and Niti Aayog, which was a report done with customers, with people who work. The World Bank terminology, they just use Bombay and Delhi and accountants and lawyers to do this ranking. So it's not as useful. And if you actually, if you look at both these reports, you learn a lot more. Actually, in fact, there has been significant progress in many areas, such as starting a business. The failure, again, is the failure of our bureaucracy. They have not communicated these achievements to the entrepreneur. For example, 2/3 of our states now have a single window clearance. But people don't know. Entrepreneurs don't know that there's a single window clearance. Now, that is what that's why governance, to me, the reform of the state precedes all other reforms. But we should still celebrate, even though Shashi is feeling a bit down on it, but we should still celebrate the fact.
In fact, when they measure the impact of GST, we go down again. It's been designed by bureaucrats for bureaucrats, the multiple forms and the multiple...
I think he's right. Actually, we may go down next year because of the problems that we have created with demonetization and GST.
So, I'll just also require, the fact that is that, we have gone from 130 to 100. So let's be clear, that's still at 100. And he's absolutely right that there was this report that the government, along with IDFC, came out about the ease of doing business across states. And I think that's a very important report because you see, while this is a time series which we have improved on, we needed to create a baseline for that, which we have done this year. Now, hopefully, we will issue that, maybe not every year, but every few years, because it's quite a hard thing to do every year. But if we do it even every few years, The fact is, now that we have a baseline, we will be able to measure ourselves much better on those parameters.
And Sanjeev, I would add that if I were the Prime Minister of India, you can condense that IDFC Niti Aayog report with a one-pager on every state. If I were Mr. Modi, I'd pick up the phone and call every chief minister every day of every BJP state.
No. And there's something called federalism here. I don't think this is a good idea.
No,
the point is to have it decentralized, and the idea was to have a format on which you can measure them from time to time.
Yeah, but
I think it would be way too prescriptive having this planning commission top-down approach.
Not planning commission. If Mr. Modi promised us when we elected him in 2014, promised us jobs, promised us growth, vikas. This is the single biggest thing that can pick up vikas.
So there are ways of doing it. I'm not objecting to the idea. I'm just objecting to the idea that it should be done in this particular top-down, phone every morning kind of way. The idea was to create a matrix of some sort, which not just this government, maybe one day if Mr. Tharoor ever is in power, he will also use it. But the point is to create a particular format in which you can measure, and state governments can also measure this. So
to make these guys
yes, it is accountable because you have this format in which you measure yourself. Would be a terrible idea, I think, that the Prime Minister of the country personally phones up and tries to do it in every state himself.
That's what a good CEO does of a successful enterprise.
Good CEOs enable good people at the ground level, let them be, and provide them with a matrix on which they measure from time to time.
A good CEO gets into the messy details of running the business. He doesn't just create a strategy. He gets into the messy details.
He will.
That's
for the
what
central
he has
government.
to do.
The question is whether she do it for things in which the state government has its prerogative. And I disagree with that. I think competitive federalism was about decentralization, and we're quite clear about it.
All right, moving on to the next question.
Hi there. I have two quick questions. But firstly, it's a pleasure to have all of you here. My first question is, if the elephant has to rise and delve into globalization, then why is it that though we come from the least integrated region on this planet, we have the smallest diplomatic corps there for a major country? And my second question is, Mr. Tharoor, will you give me an autograph after this?
With pleasure. Actually, on your first question, as you may already be aware, these are issues that I have raised for some time, and both aspects of the question are important. We do come from the least integrated sub-region in the world. South Asia is the least integrated. Our own trade with each other is something like a pathetic 2% of our collective GDPs, whereas most other regions have a minimum of 25%. ASEAN, I think, is even higher in terms of their rate of trade amongst each other. So we are not integrated. Partly it's because we're bedeviled by politics. You know that Pakistan was definitely very obstructive in SAARC. Partly there is an asymmetry within our region that we can't help. When we sit around the table with the other SAARC members, we account for 70% of the collective population and 80% of the GDP. So whether we like it or not, we displace a certain amount of weight around the table. And let's face it, anywhere in the world, small countries don't like very big neighbors. There's a wonderful line by the Mexican statesman Porfirio Diaz, a century ago, who said, you know, my poor country, so far from God and so close to the United States. So, many of our neighbors feel the same way about us, and that's also part of the problem. But fortunately, we're trying new experiments, for example, sub-regional things like the BBIN, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, which has it's not going to be easy, it's not smooth sailing or smooth riding, because right now the Bhutanese, who are becoming more and more democratic, have objected strongly to Indian and Bangladeshi vehicles being able to drive on their roads without a permit, and as a result Bhutan is essentially pulling out of that particular agreement. So integration will not be easy, partly because of these asymmetries, but pushing it is extremely necessary. On the question of the diplomatic corps, this is not only an issue I have raised in my own writings, but the committee I chair in Parliament, the Standing Committee on External Affairs, has submitted an official report to Parliament decrying the fact that our foreign service is the same size as that of Singapore or New Zealand. It is an utter disgrace. We have about 800 IFS professionals. Brazil has about 1,200 in the same category. China has 6,000. The US is 20,000. We can't get to that level, but we can certainly do better than 800. And there are a number of reasons why this, but I would commend, if you don't mind, the report on the IFS on the Lok Sabha website, which will give you our reasoning in some detail. But the short answer is, you are right to flag it. We need to dramatically expand, and the Foreign Service and the government's preferred way of merely increasing the intake each year doesn't solve the problem today. If you're recruiting extra people this year, they'll be ready in 10 years to do the things you need to be able to do now, for which you're short-staffed. I mean, honestly, disgracefully short-staffed in terms of India's challenges and responsibilities in the world today.
The lady here in the center.
Hi. So my question is very simple. So don't you think that we take the definitions on the matrix of development and underdevelopment for granted mostly? So the new India and the developed India model that we think about and that we talk about is usually the American or the Western model of them being developed, right? So, and while imposing it, we usually end up oppressing the marginalized and the tribals that we hope to uplift. So don't you think that we fail at providing any agency to the people in defining these very definitions of developed and underdeveloped?
Yeah, I disagree. The way I think, and this is the point I was making, why China and India are not going to make it very easily, is ultimately governance. What makes a developed country from a less developed country is not money, not wealth. Those are outputs. The enabling condition. Why America is a great country is not because of McDonald's or Levi jeans, but because of governance, of predictability when you step outside your home, when you have a problem with your neighbor. And that, to me, is why the state was created, and that's the difference between being developed and underdeveloped.
Could I also add that in my definition, the developed world has rules which are equal for everybody. And in India, when we talk of various parameters, the fact that the rules can be interpreted and be defined by different people to suit themselves, and it's kind of endorsed by the state, when we talk of developed world and the underdeveloped world, in the underdeveloped world we always think of anarchy, and developed world is always order. Order comes from following rules, and those rules are followed by everybody.
This is a literary festival. I'll quote the first paragraph of the great Indian novel, where I said that India is not an underdeveloped country, but a highly developed country in an advanced state of decay. Now that decay is what we're trying to fix, I guess, but look, there are various definitions. People will tell you, the developed country is one where you can drink water right out of the tap. Okay? Or a developed country is one where the buildings are freshly painted every couple of years. Or a developed country is one where everyone has the same rights and feels the ability to exercise them. I take your point about agency as an important kind of definition. That in a developed country, as we would aspire for India to be, that everybody feels equally empowered, either vis-a-vis the state or vis-a-vis each other, vis-a-vis their own communities, not being oppressed either by caste or class or gender or creed or any of those things. And there we have a long way to go. But I don't at the same time move away. As Gurcharan said, there are a number of fundamental things we all need. Whether we're tribals or whether we're city-dwelling upper castes, some things need to work for us. And it seems to me that ultimately is something we need to aspire to for everyone.
We take the last two questions now. The gentleman on the left.
Good evening, sirs and ma'am. My question is not directly directed to anyone in particular, but we were talking about the new India in 2022. So I really would want to know that what should be the definition of patriotism in new India? Because currently I personally believe the definition of patriotism is on a very shaken ground, and I would really like to know that. And just a curious, comical question to you, sir. You acknowledged Varanasi. So, are you acknowledging it because it is a Prime Minister's constituency?
Yeah, I think you can easily go into the net and Google up my views on urban design, and you will see I've been talking about this general paradigm, including Varanasi, for over a decade, about organic urban design and so on. So this is not something I just came up with today.
On the question of patriotism, one of the best essays I've read was by George Orwell, where he made a difference between patriotism and nationalism. And I think that's a very pertinent lesson for us today. The difference is that both patriots and nationalists love their countries. The nationalists focus on power. The patriot focuses on things, the childhood, the memories, the geography, the history of the country. And the patriot sometimes also asks the question, why should his loyalties stop at the border of a country?
Yeah, I mean, I love the Orwell essay, though I'm not sure it goes fully enough. I mean, I define it slightly differently. Patriotism is you love your country because it's yours. Despite all its flaws, you can see the bad things, you can complain about the bad things, but you're a patriot because it's your country. The nationalist claims to love his country because it's better than any other country. And he wants it to put in. The ultra-nationalist, of course, wants to bash other countries in the process of celebrating his country. But what's interesting today in the debate, and I'm assuming that lies behind your question, is the extent to which patriotism and nationalism are being redefined to exclude certain segments of our society. And there, I think, there is a major distinction between the all-inclusive patriotism and nationalism of the freedom struggle of the nationalist movement, which basically proceeded from the premise that India is a country that belongs to everyone in it who's ever been in it. Nehru's famous metaphor of the palimpsest. The palimpsest is, if you write something, let's say, on a wall, and somebody comes and writes on top of that without erasing what you've written, and a third person comes and writes on top of that too, and people keep on writing. At the end, what you've got is a palimpsest. And that's how Nehru, for example, saw India. Something to which everybody of various kinds of backgrounds and histories has contributed over the years, and which belongs equally to everyone. Versus a more narrowly defined sectarian vision of India that sees this essentially as a pristine Hindu country that others have come and injected their foreign bodies into. Now, these two visions are fundamentally incompatible. And ultimately, those of us who define patriotism by love for the all-inclusive India face up against a different definition of patriotism and nationalism that defines it only as that of a certain kind of people, worshipping a certain way, speaking a certain language, adhering to certain institutions, shouting certain slogans.
Food.
And not eating certain kinds of food, you're quite right. So that narrow definition is what is unacceptable to the first kind of people. I'm proud to be amongst the first kind of people. I believe in an inclusive India.
Actually, the way that I look at patriotism is very personal. It's a deeply personal relationship that the individual or I have with my country. And I don't need to wear it on my sleeve. I don't need to impose my relationship with my country on anybody else. So if I am also religious, I believe in God. That is strictly between God and me. I don't have to impose it on anybody else. And similarly, patriotism is what I feel about my country. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be ugly. It's my country. I can feel anything about it. But at the root, I also believe that the base of patriotism is also a willingness and a belief that there is something good in the country because I choose to believe in it. I don't know the difference, and it's a matter of debate between nationalism and patriotism and variety of other things. But to me, it's a very, very personal thing. And going forward, I think all the young India is deeply patriotic. People of our generation, I guess, we come together only when there's a cricket match with Pakistan, and then we are all very, very patriotic. But I find when I interact with the youth of today, that there is this deep sense of pride and a relationship with the country, which is not all good all the time. But they do have a relationship with the country, and at some level they're also proud of it. And for me, that's patriotism.
Thank you. We have time.
Let me say that I am at least glad that Shashi agreed that the National Freedom Movement was a national and wide movement and didn't just include one dynasty. But I would say that the thing is that national spirit is an important thing. The opposite of healthy nationalism is not just ultra-nationalism. It's also nihilism. And I think there is an important place for feeling a certain pride in one's culture, in one's, whether it's Swachh Bharat or cleaning up the place or in the history, and not being indifferent to it. Now, if one takes that to an extreme, certainly it is bad, but also to simply be indifferent to it, I think is also an issue that one needs to, so there is a balance between the two that needs to be struck.
Well, we have time only for one last question.
I have the mic
on the left.
So continuing the framework of organic development, that the whole world, it turns urban, every urbaner will have to become a farmer. So I'm from agriculture and rural development background. So my question is that we have talked about manufacturing and the low-hanging fruits, construction. What about food processing as an industry? What about decentralized food processing models, promoting those models? Say through viability gap funding, Kevinters have done phenomenal work in West Bengal. A farmer's son does not want to do on-farm agriculture. What about alternate? Because your skill base is aligned with agriculture, it's easier to skill them in food processing. So how do we go about that? What is your stance on that?
Okay, so let me clarify. The fact that you want to move people out of agriculture doesn't mean that you're going to dump agriculture. Let's be very clear. 45%. Question is, do you need 45% of our workforce working in this sector? And quite frankly, the rest of the world gets away with much fewer people working and don't seem to have a food problem.
In fact, 67% of our population dependent on agriculture.
Yes. So the question is, the first thing is, I think it is a fair thing to say that we should move people out of agriculture doing other things. That doesn't mean that we should ignore agriculture. Number one. Number two, you've got to understand that even rural India is changing very rapidly. It is not only about agriculture. There's all kinds of interesting ideas, things going on in rural India incidentally, which increasingly, as hopefully an infrastructure is built, whether it's electricity supply, whether roads and highways get built out, hopefully we'll be able to do agri-business, for example. One of the reasons you can't do agri-business is it requires cold storage, for example. If you don't have electricity supply, the game is not even on. And now you have done cold storage, you have to ship that to places that people want to eat that thing. So all of this requires some basic infrastructure, which has taken us a long, long time to get done. But I think we are now finally reaching critical mass in many of these areas. So it is not just a transformation of agriculture or rural India, but it requires a certain level that we needed to hit. Hopefully we will hit it soon. By the way, literacy too, among other things.
I'm sorry Shireen is not here to hear this, but I agree with Sanjeev. But I want to add a couple more things. The first thing is that indeed too many people are trying to live off the land, more than we can sustain, and that's one of the many reasons which have contributed to farmer suicides and so on. A lot of agriculture is today unviable at the micro level, and we need to face to that squarely. Secondly, decentralized agricultural processing makes sense. And I can give you an example from my own state of Kerala, where Ayurveda has resulted in a number of local sort of Ayurvedic ashrams and treatment centers growing, processing and manufacturing their own medicines, not just for the patients they're treating in those ashrams, but also to sell to the patients to carry away and to dispatch elsewhere. So you're actually seeing a commercially viable thing out of a local area in one product. I'm sure similar things could be done for other products. Third, You know, it's interesting. If you want, for example, to answer the telephone with somebody in England talking about the washing machine not working and you read them their rights under the guarantee card, why do you have to be in Gurgaon? Why can't you be in Juri Talaya? I mean, rural India can sustain the moment we have those electricity connections that Sanjeev is talking about, but also broadband connections, which successive governments have come up with targets they failed to meet. You could conceivably transfer certain currently urban professions to rural areas. There is no reason why BPOs, business process outsourcing, couldn't happen in a properly equipped village rather than in a big town necessarily. Because ultimately you're a disembodied voice on a phone or your 2 fingers, 10 fingers on a computer screen. It doesn't matter where you're sitting. So my answer to you is a compound of Sanjeev's, that what you're saying is feasible, what he's saying is also correct. We need to merge them together, but we definitely need solutions. And I must say that right now, all we've done for agriculture for 70 years is not tax it, which in many ways has been counterproductive economically, as Gurcharan has written. We have failed to come up with sensible solutions to recurring problems of agricultural credit. We have failed to come up with sensible problems for soaking up surplus labor and seasonal unemployment. Things were beginning to change. In Rega, even though many around this group probably don't like it and the government decried it initially, did 2 things that I think we completely underestimate. It actually managed to end distress migration from the villages and to raise rural purchasing power as well as rural wages in ways that had never been seen amongst the underclass of rural India before. And we need to build on that. We need to give poor people in the villages better life opportunities, not just through make-work projects, but through real-work projects like BPOs, food processing, and so on.
With this, we come to the close of today's session. I know you have many more questions, and our authors and speakers will be here tonight to address those and sign copies. Thank you so much, Gurcharan, Shashi, Sonu, and Sanjeev for this wonderful session. Let's have a huge round of applause for our speakers. And thank you to all of you for being here.